Good afternoon and welcome to the National Gallery of Victoria. I begin by acknowledging that we meet on the unceded land of the Kulin people of Naarm, which we now know as Melbourne. I am on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to them and their elders. If you're joining us remotely today, I would like to acknowledge that many other people present in today's talk may be on the lands of other traditional custodians and pay respect to those communities wherever they are as well. We're here today to talk about Chanel in context, and particularly Chanel's world in the context of modernism and modernity in changing times. So what we're going to talk about in this panel today is to understand how Gabrielle Chanel's designs fit within 20th century design history, and more broadly, how ideas of modernity and modernism inform the interpretation of her fashion designs and her overall style aesthetic. Gabrielle Chanel is often hailed as the key modernist designer, with the modernity of her clothes associated with a reduced line, a functional approach to women's dress, and attention to ease of movement, comfort, and a lack of unnecessary ornamentation. Her modernity is often associated with the liberation of women from constraining fashions that reflected their constrained social status. Aspects of her modernity are her penchant for comfort, practicality, functionality, and style. The strength and timelessness of those creations arose from an ability to harmonise function and form, marrying her design instinct with a quest for a new ideal grounded in the reality of women's lives. Throughout her career, Chanel's design style became a template for modern living. Against the short-lived novelty of contemporary trends, Chanel remained consistent and assured for the continuing relevance of her aesthetic, revealing the flexibility and force of a singular style. She introduced an aesthetic of streamlined modernity to fashion that resonated with the dramatic changes to women's social roles following the First World War. So in order to contextualise some of her dates, the dates of her career against what was happening at the time, in 1910, Chanel opens her clothing boutique at 21 Rue Cambon in Paris. In 1912, she opens another shop in Deauville, which is on the beach, so on the coast, with chic sportswear for women. In 1914, World War I commences, and the year after, in 1915, Chanel opens her first couture boutique in Biarritz on the Basque coast, in a townhouse opposite the casino. So she's relocated herself away from Paris, and she is in an area which attracts rich cosmopolitan clientele. In 1916, Chanel begins to use soft-knitted jersey, which is an example of which you'll see as you first walk into the exhibition. And in 1918, the war ends and Chanel opens a couture boutique at 31 Rue Cambon. So apart from the war, this world is also set against a background of mass social mobility that is associated with modernity. So Elizabeth Wilson writes, in the modern city, the new and different sounds the dissonance of reactions to what went before. So it's a whole new world. That moment of dissonance is key to 20th century style. The colliding dynamism, the thirst for change, the heightened sensation that characterised the city societies, particularly of modern industrial capitalism, go to make up this modernity, and the hysteria and exaggeration of fashion well express it. Other aspects of modernity include shifts to the city, severed ties with markers of identity such as religion, community or family, and thus the ability to situate oneself in the city and independently of one's past. Dress then takes on a key function in forging one's perhaps new identity. Fashionable dress of the Western world becomes one's means whereby an always fragmentary self is glued together into the semblance of a unified identity. Fashion speaks of the tension between the crowd and the individual. So these are just some of the things that I'm going to talk about and we're going to talk about together with my panellists. So my name's Paolo Di Ciocchio. I'm a fashion curator here at the National Gallery of Victoria. I'm joined by Dr. Natalya Lusty, who is Professor of Cultural Studies at University of Melbourne and an ARC Future Fellow. Her work examines the aesthetic, political and cultural forms of modernism and modernity, including fashion. She is co-founder of Critical Fashion Studies Research Group at the University of Melbourne. Next to her is Dr. Jess Berry, who is Senior Lecturer, Design History and Theory at Monash University. Jess's interdisciplinary research considers relationships between fashion and spatial practices. Her most recent monographs are House of Fashion, Haute Couture and the Modern Interior, in which she does discuss Chanel's modern interior, so we'll be discussing that too, and Cinematic Style, Fashion, Architecture and Interior. She also undertakes research that intersects gender and spatial equality in public space through her work with Monash University XYX Lab. We also have a third panellist joining us. This is a pre-record from London, and this is with Professor Amy Delahaye. So Amy Delahaye is a curator, writer and tutor. She is Rootstein Hopkins Chair of Dress History and Curatorship and Joint Director of the Research Centre of Fashion Curation at London College of Fashion at University of Arts London. Much of her work is united by an emphasis upon interpreting items of fashion and dress, often imprinted with wear and occasionally completely perished, to tell stories about lives lived. So if you'll watch the video screens, we'll be joined by Amy now with her address.
Hello, my name is Amy Delahaye. I'm a writer and a curator. I've been working on Chanel for maybe over 30 years, and funnily enough, I didn't really ever go looking for Chanel. She came to me. My professor, Lou Taylor, had been given a manuscript to read by a well-known writer that wasn't very good, and the publisher were really keen to move forward, and so they took a chance on a complete novice. And so I became an unwitting expert, I suppose. And over the course of 3 decades, I've tried to find new angles into looking at Chanel's work, and I have become increasingly interested in not only her designs, but also her biography. So Chanel's often been quoted as saying that a woman should dress like a caterpillar by day and a butterfly by night. And to date, and myself certainly in my early career, historians and curators, we privileged the modernity of her designs and the functionalism of her designs. On the whole, we've tended, and not unsurprisingly because they were incredibly radical, but we've examined her use of utilitarian fabrics, often menswear fabrics, notably like wool jerseys and tweeds. We've also explored the absence of colour, her love of black, white and beige, and her appropriation of menswear for the female wardrobe, which today doesn't seem radical, but in 1915, 16, 17 through the 20s, it was incredibly radical. There are all sorts of photographs of Chanel with the Duke of Westminster, who was her lover, not only wearing menswear styles, but actually wearing his clothes, wearing like baggy loose tweed suits and caps. And throughout her life, quite often it was her love affairs that inspired her collections, and so she went on to buy a tweed mill in Scotland, and that massively influenced her work. We've also looked at how her designs have been inspired by sporting clothes and also mainly masculine occupational dress. However, I became increasingly aware that Chanel wasn't an uncompromising modernist. She didn't reject the use of historical references. She certainly didn't subscribe to a utopian ideology that design could transform society. In fact, far from it. She was shockingly elitist, and whilst many might say that she'd emancipated women from restrictive fashion, she certainly wasn't an emancipator of women. In The Glass of Fashion, Cecil Beaton wrote that, and I quote, "Chanel's personality, like her designs, was something of a paradox." Excuse me. It was a mingling of the masculine and intensely feminine. And when we look at how different artists depicted Chanel herself, we see that same tension. For instance, in 1922, the Cubist sculptor Jack Lipchitz depicted Chanel as the embodiment of the modern woman in a bronze sculpture of her shoulders and head, whilst Marie Laurencin used soft shifting colours and fluid lines to present a much more dreamy, romantic painted portrait. And I just became increasingly interested in the tensions and also the fact that, as with fashion in dress, there are fashions in academia and museology, and certainly through the 1990s, the 2000s, and into the early 2010s, most of us were completely preoccupied with modernity. And so I just started looking at the things that we edited out, in fact. You know, when we were writing our text, what did we edit out? And quite often we edited out the more romantic designs because they simply didn't fit our narratives. So Cecil Beaton was absolutely right, in fact. Chanel's fashions reflected a mingling of the masculine and the feminine, the resolutely modern and the romantic, and quite often a combination of the two. While Chanel's daywear generally adheres to modernist principles, her evening wear and some of her daywear reveals her passion for materiality, for romance, for historical revival styles, and surprisingly, perhaps for decoration. And it was certainly in these areas that the really supreme skills of her couture atelier really came into their own. So in museum collections, it's when we look at these evening garments that we really do see the exquisite workmanship undertaken. During the 1920s, many of Chanel's evening dresses are actually quite interesting hybrid styles. They're simultaneously modern and romantic. They draw on fashion's past while anticipating fashion's future. And most notably, for summer 1920, Chanel presented, in many ways, an ultra-modern little black dress, but it was encased with a mock crinoline. So if you imagine a straight, linear black dress with a crinoline that was a sort of this shape, but very soft wires with tulle, so it was semi-transparent. Now, humour is really rare in Chanel's fashion vocabulary, and I think this dress reveals a rare light-hearted touch. As I said, the crinoline's made from finely held tulle, held out by 3 chiffon-covered whalebone hoops. And the purity of form and explicit emphasis on structure made visible certainly complies with modernist ideal principles. Yet the overall design also references fashion of the 1860s, which certainly was not modernist. And we can see perhaps similar narratives when we look at Chanel's little black dresses. And although black in fashion certainly dates back to the 15th century, Chanel was an incredible self-publicist and has been credited with launching the little black dress in 1926. And again, this was perfectly in tune with modernism's spiritual affinity with notions of standardization and democratic ideals. And Chanel's black dresses were ideally suited for the mass market, which she didn't mind because she was absolutely always aware that the materiality, that the luxury of her designs, the fine cut would always show through. And when I became curator of the V&A in the early 1990s, I started really looking at the Chanel clothes in the collections. And yes, the silhouettes were simple. Yes, on occasions the fabric was simple, but actually they were really finely worked. They were really elegantly embroidered, even if it was self-coloured embroidery. And of course they were, because women were paying a huge amount for these dresses. And whilst we might talk about a poverty to looks, actually wealthy women did not want to look poor. By about 1923, Chanel's business is really thriving. She's employing about 3,000 workers. And in 1925, she's asked to contribute a dress for the 1925 Paris exhibition. And the specifications for that exhibition were, I quote, articles of modern aspiration. So ever contrary, Chanel presents a garçon-style dress. It's in a modernist palette. It's cream with silver. But she designs it with a mock tabard, and on that tabard is really intricately an intricately beaded design of medieval scrollwork and heraldic motifs. So again, we get that incredible tension between modernity and romance. By 1927, much of the detailing of designs, Chanel's evening wear becomes integral rather than applied, and that year Vogue described her evening dresses as simple in aspect and complex in aspiration. But by as we move into the 1930s, Chanel's clothes become much, much more romantic. And interestingly, she feeds into the whole vogue for elite fashion's preoccupation with underwear as outerwear. It's a trend, that's a trend that we could actually explore in the context of the Surrealists, who we might even consider, I guess, as Surrealism's modernism's other. And they challenged the status quo by reversing accepted ideas and practices surrounding interior and exterior public and private spaces. And whilst male designers like Charles James presented really structured, corseted dresses, Chanel, like Vionnet, in the early 1930s, designs a range of really delicate lingerie styles that are unbelievably romantic. By the mid-1930s, we get a trend in fashion which I'm really fascinated by, the neo-Victorian or romantic revival. And we see a complete vogue for dresses with evening wear, particularly evening gowns with bustles, corseted crinolines. And although Chanel had absolutely rejected those early in her career, she absolutely revels in unashamed romance. Her garments are covered in lace, they're sculpted. She designs lots of fancy dress for really elite costume balls, and lots of hers are the designs that not only she designs for her clients, but also that she wears herself, are in the late 19th century style. Chanel also made use of flowers, which is the subject of the essay I've written in the catalogue that accompanies this exhibition. Most famously, we do know about her love of camellias. And camellias were really popular with aristocratic women in the 19th century. And so again, Chanel's choice of this bloom with its perfectly symmetrical petals, which again has a sort of modernist appeal, fed directly into that vogue. And we also see it on her jewellery. It's pinned onto her clothes and it's in the motifs of her garments. Diana Vreeland was a friend of Chanel's and she was one of her clients, and she wrote, "Everyone thinks of suits when they think of Chanel. That came later. If you could see my clothes from Chanel in the 30s, the Degas gypsy dresses, the divine brocades, the little boleros, the roses in the hair, the pailleted nose veils, day and evening, and the ribbons were so pretty." So there is a very different narrative from Chanel that we can see that she continues right through her career. So even when we're looking at perhaps her 1950s really softly tailored wool suits, they're often lined with floral fabric. And that floral fabric is sometimes cut out with really incredible detail. So the workers in her atelier have cut around the floral motif so they flutter almost like petals. And again, we could say that adheres to modernists, the modernist notion of truth to material, because we're not adding extraneous decoration. But these garments, the tailoring is undeniably modernistic, but these fluttering details, these cut out, this flower work is absolutely romantic. So just to conclude, I've tried to focus on the 20s and 30s. We've seen that Chanel's designs often reflected influences from her own romantic liaisons as well as broader sociocultural trends. During the 1920s, the cut of her evening dresses is undeniably modernistic, but the decoration and the applied, sometimes detailing, is romantic. By the 1930s, it becomes much more overtly romantic, with heavily influences from Victorian styles. And yeah, I just think it's time to look at Chanel's work in a different way to see what perhaps we don't look for as well as what we're looking for. Thank you. Hello, my name is Amy Delahaye. I'm a writer and a curator.
So in a way, Amy Delahaye has told us all the ways that Chanel is not a modernist. But perhaps you could start, Natalya, by telling us some of the ways that she is and how she fits into that sort of narrative and that dialogue around modernism.
Yeah, thank you. I'd agree. I think absolutely there's lots of ways in which we can say Chanel's not a modernist, but I'd also say that modernism is replete with these kinds of contradictions. And I think it's best summed up in, Ezra Pound, who started a number of poetic movements, imagism, vorticism. I mean, he coined one of the most famous maxims of modernism, and that was make it new. And I think that sums up modernism in the way that it's not just about the reinvention of the new, but it's about making a particular kind of newness. And that can include reference to the past. So we often see this tension between the desire to go forward, to make something new, to be innovative. But really, a lot of what was produced in modernism did recycle aspects of the past. I mean, you see that in the ballet russe, you see that in all sorts of areas where things from the past are recycled and used in new ways.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess certainly with Art Deco, there was a lot of recycling of these classical kind of styles within also in relation to the geometric. So you kind of get this push and pull between the past and the present. And that's kind of, I think, also a feeling of modernity, is that kind of tension between past and present. So certainly, I think Chanel's style draws on both types of elements, both these kind of romantic elements, as Amy Delahaye was saying, but then also these very kind of geometric elements as well. So she really kind of does a dance between the two, I think, yeah.
And I think some of the examples of where you can see her references to the past come through really strongly in her jewellery, because she's referencing sort of Byzantine motifs, Renaissance iconography as well. But then, as you were speaking, Natalya, it occurred to me that one of the pasts that she is constantly referring to, I think, is her own. Because as she traverses through her career, as she keeps sort of reiterating her codes, it's almost like the past that she's referring to in the 1950s is her own past in the 1920s. So I guess that idea of being modern isn't just something that's anchored in the 20s and 30s. Can it be something that continues beyond?
Yes, I think it can be. And I think, throughout her career, I mean, she starts off with very determined set of principles in terms of how to clothe women. And these carry on throughout her career. But within that, there are these various tensions. So, I mean, you talked about the Byzantine elements in her jewellery. I mean, she started, her clothing was really made famous in terms of her clothing or her dressing of actresses and dancers. So they were the first to really showcase Chanel's innovation. And you have to remember Isadora Duncan at the time, who Chanel knew and reported to have taken dance lessons from. Isadora Duncan created this very kind of fluid style. She really didn't wear a corset. She wore bare feet, so she eschewed, point shoes, and the very strict kind of control of the body that was, associated with ballet. So, and Isadora Duncan's style, referred back to Grecian styles of costuming and movement. She was famous for wearing that sort of very boxy tunic style when she danced, and you see that come up in Chanel's work. Also, Chanel collaborated and knew many of the people involved in the ballet russe, and again, the ballet russe was an amazingly innovative modernist dance movement, but it also brought together artists, designers, musicians who were really working together and feeding off each other, but again, still going back to the roots of Russian folk culture. Byzantine elements are always in the costumes of the ballet russe. So you do get this kind of tension between making older kind of styles new in a kind of modern way. And I think key to that is bringing together this kind of the various kinds of artistic domains. So you get, bringing together artists like Picasso and Braque, and people designing, ballet scenes with designers like Chanel. You get Stravinsky, of course, coming in and really being made by Sergei Diaghilev, who was the impresario of the ballet russe, and bringing all these creatives together as a team to, realise a vision, a really quite powerful vision.
And actually thinking of that sort of quite holistic environment, Who were the people, Jess, that Chanel worked with in order to create her sort of physical environments, both at her boutique and in her home? How were they sort of reflective of her ideas as well?
Yeah, I think that we see this really dramatic contrast between what's happening in the salon and the boutique at Chanel, and then her individual apartment where she lived, and also the apartment upstairs, which was at the Ritz. So she slept at the Ritz, but kind of had an apartment also upstairs. And these are dramatically different spaces in terms of their aesthetics. Chanel is renowned for burning all of her letters and kind of like getting rid of stuff so no one really knew what was going on. So we're a bit unsure who actually designed the boutique. Okay. And so a lot of people kind of just say that it's an anonymous designer. There's some evidence that it could be that it was Jean-Michel Frank, who had made some similar mirrored kind of dressing rooms for aristocrats at the time. And there is some documentation within the Chanel archive that suggests that it was Jean-Michel Frank, but because of the rivalry with Schiaparelli, and Jean-Michel Frank was such a devotee of Schiaparelli and designed all of her boutiques, I wonder whether she might have just decided, no, he didn't design my boutique at all. So there's a little bit of debate around that, but certainly those mirrored surfaces that you see throughout the exhibition so beautifully, like rendered, and the staircase, these kind of icons of Chanel that we kind of come to think of as the epitome of her style, is such in contrast with her apartment where she lived. And I think there's an image of the Ritz that was used as a promotional campaign for the Chanel No. 5, and it's in the exhibition. She's kind of leaning on a fireplace, and you can see those lacquered screens in the background, and these what we'd call Orientalist type vases and so forth. In her apartment at Rue Cambon as well, there's these types of Baroque types of elements. So dripping chandeliers, heavily kind of ornamented, gilt figures. It's kind of like overwhelmingly decorative in a way that we don't often think of Chanel. And this is always kind of, again, referencing her past. So, there's kind of elements that she collected with Miss Assert, who was, a great muse for a lot of the modernist artists of the 20th century. So people like Edward Vuillard painted her often. So she actually, weirdly, Miss Assert and her husband Joseph went on their honeymoon with Chanel to Venice.
An interesting time.
So this was, they all went off to Venice together and had a great time picking out elements for Chanel's apartment. So Miss Assert was actually very influential in Chanel's style in the apartment, and I think this kind of contrast between the modernism that's going on in the salon and this kind of Baroque excess that's happening in the apartment is actually something to do with the two different worlds that Chanel was straddling. And that's the worlds of the avant-garde and artists, but then also the aristocracy. So I think she's kind of mixing those codes together.
That's interesting. So her apartment is sort of appealing to the aristocratic taste.
Yeah.
And her salon is appealing to the more modern and contemporary tastes.
Yeah.
So she's doing both of those at the same time in order to appeal to the widest possible market.
Exactly.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that. Because the other thing because you brought up that picture, and of course that does bring together so many elements of what she is representing. And I guess that leads me to think about that thing that we were talking about before, about the idea of the dandy and about the idea of self-creation, and how that sort of it almost comes to well, not a climax because it's still happening now, but it comes to a true sort of manifestation at the early 20th century. So the figure of the dandy is starts off as a male figure in the late 19th century, and it largely kind of reflects the idea of self-ascendancy through dress, manner, behaviour, and also sort of poise and attention to detail. So these are all things that we think of when we think of Chanel. So in a lot of ways, she was called the first female dandy or a female dandy. So Natalya, do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that's right there. I mean, I think what you see with Chanel, of course, the dandy figure had been a 19th century kind of idea that Baudelaire wrote about really succinctly, and it is precisely that aestheticization of the self. So creating out of your manners and your emotions and your clothing this work of art, and that's how Baudelaire saw it. And I think that comes into a lot of the early avant-garde movements, and it's something that Chanel picks up on. So in a way, you know, Chanel is straddling that 19th century idea of the dandy, but obviously the female dandy in her case. And you see that there's a photograph in the exhibition of her at the races in, you know, masculine garb, but still with a kind of jaunty feminine look. And that is a quintessential kind of image of the female dandy. And, you know, she almost could be a suffragette in that image. You know, she's got that kind of fierceness and, you know, she's got that determination and that ambition in that whole kind of image. But she also sort of straddles the kind of the emergence of the idea of the brand and the influencer even. So she's kind of poised between, you know, the cultivation of the self as this embodiment of a work of art, so the self in everyday life as a work of art through manners and clothing and the costume jewellery, and even the pose, you know, the sticking out the hips, putting the shoulders back. These are kind of quintessentially Chanel kind of associations, and whether she invented them or not, I mean, you know, she's credited with, you know, saying that, you know, she allowed women to kind of lose the corset. But of course, many women before Chanel were not wearing corsets. So Isadora Duncan, but also the French writer Colette had not worn a corset. But she really sort of made it her own. And so it is this kind of emergence of the idea of the brand that's so, I think, interesting in terms of straddling the idea of the dandy as a kind of aesthetic category, but also the more commercial idea of a brand and the whole concept of her work. And it really speaks to her determination, her ambition. I mean, she was an incredibly astute businesswoman. I mean, you talked about that kind of divide between the aristocratic kind of elements in her homes and the kind of modernist kind of, you know, getting rid of adornment and ornamentation. And I think you see those kinds of tensions all the way through. So, you know, she really grew up in a convent orphanage where she was learnt, you know, the skill of you know, being a seamstress. But also convent educations were really quite strict in terms of métier, this French word, for the precision of your work, of the craft, this idea of attention to detail. So she gets that from that convent background, but then she enters this kind of world of the aristocracy and, you know, it's absolutely a genius move to set up a shop in Biarritz because the war had started. All the very wealthy, influential people had escaped Paris and other European cities, and they'd all congregated in Biarritz because it was close to the Spanish border. Spain was neutral. If they needed to flee, they could. Biarritz had long been a place renowned for, you know, the Spanish and English and French aristocracies and you know, a really wealthy, but also a place where rules weren't the same as in other places. So she arrives in Biarritz and she creates garments that suit women who, in that kind of, I guess, world away from the centre or the centre of attention, women are allowed to go boating and cycling and, you know, and hiking and swimming. And so there's a certain kind of freedom allowed that you wouldn't see everywhere at that time. And this becomes a testing ground, really, for her innovations. That's where she starts to experiment with tricot, that sort of jersey that allows the movement and fluidity of the body. So it's really, you know, that moment in which she sees that opportunity, that is the sign of an absolutely astute businesswoman. She has the most uncanny business sense throughout her career. I mean, she once said, "The First World War made me famous." So she returns to Paris after the war. She's a famous couturier. But you could also say that the Second World War nearly destroyed her because of her involvement, you know, with von Dinklish, Baron von Dinklish, who, you know, was high intelligence, SS high intelligence spy. It's still uncertain the exact nature of her you know, association, but we know that, you know, she played a formidable role in those circles, and that she was almost certainly an emissary between Germany and England in terms of trying to broker a peace. So this, you know, speaks to her kind of determination and her ambition and her daring. I mean, you know, this is a woman who is also just going to do anything to survive and keep her brand alive. And I think you see that across the story of the two wars in quite, you know, striking ways.
And just only because we started at the image, just going back to that image and thinking about her in her apartment, how does that sort of, because we talked about that tension before about her, you know, very modernist aesthetic and her quite ornate aesthetic. The tension of, or what is the meaning that she's projecting by photographing not only herself as a persona, but herself in her apartment, in that picture that you referred to in the exhibition?
Yeah, I think that image is really interesting again because of this kind of contrast between a really masculine kind of stance that she's taking. It's very authoritative. She's got her arm on the mantelpiece like, this is my empire. And at the same time, she's wearing this beautiful lace dress, which is incredibly feminine and romantic and beautiful. So it's kind of like this contrast between the masculine and the feminine. But I think the main thing that she's trying to get across in that image is her independence and kind of solitary like vision of her world. And she's inviting other women into that world. So whether they can relate to that kind of feminine beauty of the lace garment or that kind of new modern woman that's represented through her masculine stance. So I think she's, again, like drawing different parts of her audience in. And I mean, the amount of images of Chanel that kind of made her iconic as this image of the modern woman, like an image of emancipation, of new kind of freedoms for women, economic freedom, being able to like be her own master. And the fact that she wasn't married, but, you know, had multiple kinds of lovers and, you know, lived this free, independent lifestyle, that was really portrayed in all the images of her. So I think she really kind of conveyed that image that appealed to so many women of the time. And in fact, the image of the modern woman was used to sell everything from cars to chewing gum. Like it was just ubiquitous everywhere, but she kind of really epitomized that image. And people really thought of her as la garçon, that French kind of boyish figure of the Victor Magritte novel and later film. So, you know, the short haircut, the pants, the masculine style. Yeah, she really conveyed those things through her imagery, and she was very clever in using her image to brand herself. Yeah. And some people would even kind of think of what she did is, even though she wasn't making furniture or interiors like some other couturiers of the time, it was certainly seen as a kind of lifestyle, that women were buying into the Chanel look and the Chanel lifestyle. And she even kind of talked about herself as a legend at the time. Like she would say, I'm a legend, you know? So she certainly built that mythology around herself as an image that people really, you know, wanted to buy into. And it continues in the brand today, which I think is really the extraordinary legacy of her work, is that all of those elements are still present. So, you know, the designers can change whether it's Lagerfeld or Vuillard, but there's an essence that remains across time, and I think, yeah, that's an amazing legacy.
Yeah, and the thing that occurs to me too, as we talk about sort of the design of her, you know, salon versus her home, is the modernist design of her boutique was about appealing to the aesthetic of the day, but it also had this extra element of surveillance because it allowed her, because of all the mirrored and faceted edges, it allowed her not only to be part of the modern world at the time, but also to observe all that was going on when she wasn't there.
Yeah, it was kind of like a panopticon where she could like hide and be kind of hidden from the audience, but then but she could see the show happening below her, so she could see how the audience would react. She is like kind of watching very carefully. No doubt she probably was like, that model didn't walk that right. But certainly she'd kind of hide away, but looking at what was happening through her position on the staircase. And again, that staircase is such an iconic image of Chanel. You know, I think there's a couple of points in the exhibition where you see the models kind of coming down the staircase with all the mirrors around them, and they're kind of refracted like this kaleidoscope, which is really reflective of Cubist painting at the time. So that kind of Marcel Duchamp nude descending the staircase, it's kind of those images of those women walking down the stairs, and they're imaged like just multiplied and refracted, and it's really conveying some of those modernist themes that we've already talked about just in the aesthetics of the building itself.
Yeah, this sort of mirrors serve to fragment the body, which is what the paintings do. And we were also talking too about sort of the language of modernism too, such as the word manifesto. So the exhibition itself is called, Gabrielle Chanel Fashion Manifesto, but that word manifesto is actually quite loaded.
Yeah, no, I was really delighted to see manifesto applied to Chanel because, of course, fashion is not something that we associate with the manifesto normally, but we certainly associate the manifesto with modernism, and of course modernism had this plethora of manifestos attached to these small avant-garde groups. And so, in the early 20th century, probably beginning with the Futurist Manifesto, but also the Dada Manifesto, Vorticism, Surrealist Manifestos, 3 of them, you start to see this form, this genre that was once used as a political tract. So the most famous, of course, is the Communist Manifesto. But by the early 20th century, it's kind of renovated into this kind of political and artistic kind of argument for newness. So the manifesto in this period is really reformulated into a way in which to carve out a sense of going forward. And what's so interesting about the manifesto form is at the same time that it has this kind of democratic, we need to do this, it's often the we speaking position, it's inclusive. It's also very elitist, so it speaks to some of the things we were talking before about modernism and the tension between, democratic change and, revisioning gender, for instance, but also, class. But there's also an elitism to all those avant-garde manifestos. And when we think about Chanel and the manifesto, what does that mean? Well, Chanel really put forward a set of design principles to do with how, the feminine body would move. I mean, she had a whole set of principles around the materials she was going to use. So in the same way that, say Le Corbusier started to use reinforced concrete to create this streamlined new architectural house and building, I mean, Chanel is using tricot, which is this kind of flat-weaved, stretchy jersey material that really makes her garments the kind of free-form, comfortable clothes that she wanted women to experience. So, all her design principles, I think, are very much kind of representative of this kind of determined sense of breaking with the past, breaking with, what had gone before in terms of ornamentation. And it's interesting, we often take for granted how radical Chanel is, but, remember Paul Poiret, dismissed Chanel, probably quite enviously by saying, her clothing looked like, what was it, undernourished telegraph boys in black jersey, which just shows you just how radical her designs were in terms of reconfiguring the feminine form, but also the way women were allowed that kind of ease of movement.
And the other thing that, as you were speaking, when I think of Chanel and those design features and the way that she changed the way that women moved, was just something as simple as the pockets. The pockets at the hips sort of allow somewhere for the hands to go and the hips to thrust forward. And that's something that you mentioned too, in that idea of poise and the way that she sort of owns that mantelpiece.
I think there's actually something really interesting where you were just talking about the manifesto and then thinking about the way that Chanel also, in a sense, made fashion democratic. So the little black dress certainly was, she talked about it as a dress that any woman could wear, whether she was a maid or an aristocrat, and certainly drew from, servants' dress in terms of the inspiration for those garments. And the fact that she allowed people to copy her, which, at the time V&A was struggling tooth and nail to keep her copyright of her garments, but Chanel was kind of like, oh, well, people are going to copy me. An army of Chanels walking around. Fabulous.
It speaks to that self-mythologizing. She could see the advantage of absolutely letting everyone copy that kind of iconic dress. So, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, really important here, I think, is the shop girl and the rise of the department store to the success of Chanel, because of course the little black dress or black was something that, shop girls, that the women that started to work in department stores were renowned in terms of wearing as a uniform. And she converted that into both, day wear and evening wear as something chic and elegant and not associated with mourning. It was also, had that kind of funereal connotations. So she gave it an absolutely kind of modern and dynamic and yet simplified kind of form that anyone could adopt, and that, as you say, still goes today, on today.
And I guess how much is the idea of repetition part of modernity? Is what's that intersection between the sort of industrialisation and capitalism and modernity? How is there a tension between the idea of the one-off and the multiple? Does that feed into the kind of modernist narrative?
Yeah, well, I think she straddled that, haute couture world and that kind of more democratic realm of, the little black dress being copied and being circulated. I mean, early on, she absolutely knew the power of, the upper classes and the aristocratic world in terms of giving her a certain kind of status in life. But she also started her career, I mean, her clothes were made famous by actresses, women who were, certainly appreciated for their artistic talents, but, not the aristocracy and not the upper classes, the demi-mode, if you like. So, she always straddled both those kinds of social worlds, the artistic world and, the world of the aristocracy and more elite kind of circles. And I think that speaks to her, desire to survive. I think she read the room, she read the world at that moment in very kind of sophisticated ways and was very prescient in terms of understanding that there was this declining aristocratic upper class world, but it wasn't going to die overnight, and she still needed its power and influence. But she also knew that there was a new modern moment emerging that would be more democratic and would change clothes in very fundamental ways.
And I guess that feeds into fashion all the way through the 20th century. The idea of repetition too makes me think of the fact that she actually styled her models and her mannequins in her own image. So she was really, really projecting not just the image of her designs through the images of herself, but also in the models and the mannequins and the styling that she chose for them. So Amy Delahaye also gave us some examples of ways that she's not modern. And did you want to speak to any of those sort of references of the 1930s and that sort of flowing, those flowing aesthetics?
Yeah, I mean, I think we covered that. I mean, in modernism, as I said earlier, there is always this tension between referencing the past and making it new, being key here. But I do think, you know, some of those elements, I mean, the flowers, her use of, you know, artificial flowers, which just look wrong. I was walking through the exhibition yesterday and, you know, with a friend and colleague, and we were just kind of wincing at the artificial flowers because they look so wrong as a Chanel item. But of course she loved those flowers, and they were key in some senses to her sense of, you know, finishing an outfit, and she always loved that kind of element. But I also think that, you know, even when you look at the more romantic dresses from the late 1920s and 1930s, where you start to see that more feminine look, she's also still very modern, particularly in terms of her necklines. So she never or rarely follows the curve of the bust and accentuates the female form. She, you know, she cuts off the bust. She has boxy necklines, that she has high necklines. So she's also still very modern, even when she's got those kind of older, feminine, romantic elements in her garments.
And actually, as you said, Jess, like that way that she fragments the body with the mirrors, you're referring to that in the way that she fragments the body with her, because her seaming is quite unconventional. There's a lot of sort of zigzag elements throughout. Did you have any comments you wanted to make?
I guess, though, as well, just in terms of that more feminine silhouette, the long kind of skirted dresses and so forth, that are more flowing. This is certainly as well, you know, just a fashion trend of the time that she's engaging with. And I don't think she was being particularly innovative in that moment. She was copying what was happening primarily in film as well, with, you know, like kind of think of the Grace Kelly kind of dancing of the 1930s. It's those kinds of silhouettes that were just in the zeitgeist, I guess. So I think she is very canny in terms of knowing what to do when. And I think, you know, in that period there is, yeah, I guess in film, all of that kind of fabulous. Of course, Chanel did film for a period, went to Hollywood. Didn't like it very much. But I think actually what's so interesting, you would think her garments would translate very well to film because they're black and white. So, of course, they should. But, yeah, she wasn't very successful there because I guess it wasn't showy enough, you know, it was too understated.
That's true, because there is a subtlety to her designs, and a lot of that comes through in the selection of sort of a single colour palette, which, and the black and white actually doesn't translate that well to film.
I think also she's designing for very wealthy clientele, and so it's hard to know, I think, you know, as you were saying, Jess, whether she's picking up on just what her clients want in a dress. They don't want to go outside what's in fashionable, but always, I think, adding her own kind of elements as well.
And in terms of, you know, you've both been through the exhibition, is there a sort of key moment for either of you that really reflects her engagement with modernism and modern design?
Oh, so many moments. I don't know where to start. I mean, I think, you know, in the first part of the exhibition, some of those simple tunic tops, and then the white lawn, I think it's lawn or cotton dress, sleeveless dress. I mean, you'd wear that today, but it's so quintessentially of its time. And then, you know, the red cape, you know, is just exquisite. And I mean, that looks like it's stepped right out of the Ballet Russe production. And some of the kind of tweed and the embroidery also is from that moment of theatre and dance in that time. So there's so many elements of modernism that, you know, they're just a few, I guess.
I actually think that the army of suits, even though it's a different period from what we're actually talking about in terms of like modernism proper in the 20th and 30s, I think they really convey, you know, the repetition, the geometric silhouette, the military kind of type elements that are, you know, underpin some of the fascism of modernism. You know, like all of those ideas are being played out actually in the way that army of Chanel is kind of charging forward into the future, wanting to transform every woman into the image of Chanel. I think that really kind of captures her modernity actually, even though it's, you know, the 50s, but yeah.
And also, you know, the little black dress being called the Ford of fashion, you know, that kind of conveyor belt production line, the Ford motor car, of course, the American Ford motor car, which made every worker in America able to afford a motor car. And this was quite revolutionary, and it was down to the particular manufacturing, you know, industrialised manufacturing processes of the time. And that's similar, I guess, to the black dress, which became possible for so many women.
Yeah, because it didn't necessarily have to be a Chanel little black dress in order to participate in what it was to live or to sort of embody the Chanel lifestyle, the Chanel ideology, which makes me think, does the period or sort of the modern period, because Chanel has quite a unique life. She, you know, she's born an orphan. She, you know, goes to a convent. She becomes this enormous, major businesswoman. How does that period, I mean, she's unique, but how does that period sort of shape or transform the experience for sort of other women? Is it the period that allows her to become who she is and the the characteristics of it, or is she sort of an entity on her own?
Oh, I think both. I think Jess talked about that self-mythologizing, which is so key to being able to reinvent yourself, but still with that kind of really determined set of design principles and that determined sort of aesthetic sensibility. So it is the time also. I mean, you know, she's credited with all these things that she didn't actually really, she wasn't the first. But, you know, in 1926, Ernest Hemingway is describing, you know, the woman with the slicked back hair, the jersey dress, saying Chanel started all that. So this kind of mythology is, you know, picked up very early on, and, you know, lots of people write about her as this kind of innovator ahead of her time. So I think it's both. The period allowed her, I mean, she saw the opportunities in Biarritz during the war. That really made her successful. I don't think that moment can be underestimated. And it was the perfect testing ground for that innovation, to start using materials and to kind of, I guess, test it on an elite and kind of small group of women who could get away with being avant-garde or pushing the boundaries in terms of dress. But it quickly, you know, got picked up by the press, and we haven't talked about the press, but the press very early on really made Chanel quite famous. So she was picked up in the theatre journals of the time because she was dressing actresses and dancers. She was picked up in the American press. So, you know, she came at a moment where she was very good at understanding how the press worked, which is part of, you know, her success, I think.
And also part of the modern world. Because you're right, it is, and particularly the press was important with her relaunch after 1954, because the Chanel suit, which we know so well today, wasn't actually an immediate success. It was very successful after a couple of seasons, but particularly its popularity in America that led it to the success that we know today. We've talked about many aspects of Chanel, and there are going to be many, many more aspects that you'll enjoy through the exhibition. So I'd like to thank my panellists for joining me today, and I'd like to invite you all to view the exhibition after this. Thank you so much.